I'm Sarah Muir. It's a pleasure to have you join us here today for our session on Think Local with the SDGs, exploring the importance of local level action in achieving our global goals. Again, my name is Sarah. I'm the program manager for the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. PICS, as we call it, is hosted and led out of the University of Victoria in partnership with the University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, and the University of Northern British Columbia. I'm based at the University of British Columbia campus, and I report also to the UBC Sustainability Hub, who is co-hosting the SDG Week Canada with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and others. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I have 4 other colleagues joining me for the webinar today. Kusum Waijasekara, Luis Patricio, Laura Schnur, and Danielle Noble-Brandt, all here to share their thoughts and experiences about the SDGs at the local level. So with that brief introduction for myself, I'm going to pass it on, and I'll pass it to you, Kusum, to introduce yourself and provide a land acknowledgement for us as well, and then pass it on to the next panelist. Welcome.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm excited to be here. I want to start off by with the land acknowledgement. And as I will be speaking about the Kelowna VLR, I would like to acknowledge that Kelowna is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx or Okanagan peoples. I found an article to help me understand why we carry out land acknowledgement, and it also helps highlight the protocol. So I would like to share it I'd like to share the link in the chat box, and I encourage everyone today on this webinar to spend 5 minutes to read it and learn about why it's important for us to carry out a land acknowledgement. So a bit about myself is I'm an engineer, and I've worked in the aerospace industry, agriculture, and currently I work in construction for the government of Nunavut. But I worked with the BC Council of International Cooperation to develop Canada's first VLR for the community of Kelowna, BC. And before that, I was the chair of GECO, which is the Central Okanagan chapter of BC Council for International Cooperation. And what we did there was we supported sustainable local as well as global change using the SDGs as a framework. So maybe I will pass it on to my colleague, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Kusum. I would also like to share that I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. I'm currently an urban planner, and my position here at the City of Kelowna is as the Department Manager of Policy and Planning. My portfolio is quite broad-reaching, but we advance policy direction on a wide range of activities, including commencing a healthy city strategy, a climate action update, the adoption of our 2040 official community plan, and various other strategies for revitalizing neighborhoods. I really place an emphasis on collaborating across sectors with the intention of advancing a built environment that is going to improve health, equity, and connectedness for communities. I really just want to acknowledge that we're at a really pivotal point in this moment in history where I really truly believe that there's a vast opportunity to address and evoke meaningful change in topics such as unemployment, inequality, food insecurity, and climate vulnerability, and the SDGs have an important role in that. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Laura.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Laura Schnur. I'm Director of Community Climate Transitions at Tamarack Institute, and I'm joining today from Tiohtià:ke, the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples, colonially known as Montreal. And here at Tamarack, we're a nonprofit, been around since 2001, working at the pan-Canadian level to support communities to solve complex challenges through resident-led and cross-sector approaches. And my role here, I'm leading Tamarack's work on the SDGs and on climate and equity. And one thing I want to mention is together with SDSN Canada, we're co-hosting a monthly community practice around SDG localization, and would welcome anyone who's interested to join, and we'll put a link in the chat for you. I see in the participants, we have some members of that group already. So that's one thing that we're actively doing around localizing the framework. I'll pass it to you, Luis.
Thanks, Laura. I'm joining from the traditional territories of Arawandran, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Lenape peoples in the city known as London, Ontario, Canada. I'm the SDG Cities co-lead, and I work at Pillar Nonprofit Network. Our program is a partnership with 10C in Guelph, also in Southwestern Ontario, and we're working on supporting local networks, organizations, governments in implementing, understanding, and implementing the SDGs at the local level. This happens either through explicit SDG framework or the interconnection of social, economic, and environmental dimensions of the work that happens in all those different sectors. And one of the goals of our project is to have tools that can be replicated and shared and used by any city in Canada. Happy to be here. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the introductions. And as you can see, we have a range of great perspectives from engineers to those representing nonprofit organizations to a city planner here today to share their thoughts on the SDGs and what it means for cities and communities. And I wanted to frame, I guess I have some questions to ask our folks here, but I wanted to frame the questions with the recent experience I had. I was recently on a Tamarack and an SDSN Canada community practice call with other colleagues from across the country. And I was surprised to learn that in some places, the SDGs are quite controversial here in Canada. And this may be, as Danielle pointed out when we were talking about this, a result of a shifting landscape at the national level, or maybe even a polarization of views at all levels of government. And I was thinking in some cases, this may mean a need to really increase the level of discussion around the SDGs. And in other cases, local governments may be doing this work, but less keen to formally align as such. So I brought these folks together to share maybe their perspectives and observations about if and how SDGs can be a common language or tool to best help communities and Canada advance the sustainable development goals. And so really to kind of launch the discussion today, I thought I'd just start generally with maybe question to Luis and Kusum about what does localizing the SDGs mean? Do one of you want to jump in there?
Sure, I can start. So basically, the SDGs cover social, economical, environmental, security challenges faced by nations and communities across the globe. Basically, any problem or issue we face can be tied to one of the SDGs targets or indicators. To me, what localizing the SDG means is we can translate these universal concepts such as poverty and narrow it down to understand how it affects people in a specific community, and then identify how we address it, because one size fits all doesn't work, and it definitely doesn't work in a diverse country such as Canada. So if we take the concept of poverty and focus on chronic homelessness, the rates and reasons that the increases are occurring differ community by community. And if the reasons differ, the solutions absolutely have to also differ. So we need to understand clearly what is it caused by in that specific community. Is there a housing crisis? Is housing affordability a major problem? Are vacancy rates too high? These are linked to goal 11. You know, if we look at goal 9, do you have high unemployment rates? Or if we look at goal 9, which is transportation, are there equitable modes of transportation within that community? And even with regards to health, you know, some communities are struggling with high mortality rates due to the opioid crisis, while others aren't. So when you really have to look at what is being addressed, what is the issue in that community. So large hubs in Canada may have great transportation networks, while rural centers don't. So we can't look at the issue the same way. So localizing the SDGs allows communities to focus in on the most pressing issues and address them in a way that is sustainable for that community.
Okay, thanks, Kusum. What about you, Luis? Some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can speak a little bit about what you're talking about, polarization, because I think when that happens, it's usually that misunderstanding that the SDGs is this global agenda, and it's a conversation only for international bodies of government and corporation and multinational groups. When the SDGs, we can all agree at the high level goals. We're talking about zero hunger and health and education and clean water and all those things. We can all agree on those levels. They're all aspirational goals, but localizing the SDGs is understanding, as Kusum was saying, that the challenges that each region, each city face are different, and also the assets that we have on those different places. So the solutions and how we track progress, it is different. So it also means that we don't need to start from scratch. It's not just parachuting an agenda from somewhere else into your city, into your municipality. It's actually the opposite. It's really highlighting the needs, your challenges that you're facing in your community, and bring this to a higher forum where you can share their information with others. So that's, for me, that's what localization means.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I like that idea. You don't need to start from scratch. And I guess with that, Laura and Danielle, what do you think the SDGs framework provides to cities and communities in Canada? Maybe Laura, you could.
Sure. Yeah, and really just building off what Kusum and Luis shared, like one, it's a shared language and a shared vision, right, for all of humanity. In this way, it's really unique. So it's relevant and known across organizations and sectors and across geographies. So from school children in Ghana who can recite the SDGs and study them, to corporate executives in Korea, to all of us here today. It's a shared language for us all to use and a common vision. It was democratically selected, unlike the Millennium Development Goals that preceded it, which were really thought up in the basement of the UN by a few, Jeffrey Sachs and a few others. The SDG framework is the result of the largest consultation process in the UN's history. So more than 1 million people participated, and there was an expert group of over 3,000 participants from over 100 countries who helped establish this framework. Another element is it enables people to connect with others and network with others in different jurisdictions and in different sectors. So because of that shared language, community sector and businesses might be able to speak to one another in ways that they weren't previously able to. Opportunity to showcase your work and impact and really bring visibility to what you're doing locally by speaking that SDG language connects you to others around the world who are similarly contributing to the framework is another element. And finally, measuring and comparing how one's doing, how a community is doing, how a nation is doing, helps us celebrate success where we're doing well and helps galvanize action in areas where we might be doing less well and could use improvement. So those are a few. How about you, Danielle?
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to take it from that kind of very broad scale to a little bit more of a local municipal scale. And considering that cities represent more than half of the world's population, 2/3 of the global economy, it can confidently be said that the SDGs have been adopted in a very urban world. And for this reason, it's really critical that city level action is where things are going to be most needed for the SDGs to be successful. And that's why it's so important for local and regional governments to be empowered. However, local governments really are at this intersection of many challenges, including a public health and economic crisis. There's entrenched racism and inequality and a looming climate crisis. And meanwhile, local governments across many different scales sometimes need systems to share, track, and interpret those performance metrics of these interlinked challenges. And sometimes that can be either incomplete or non-existent. So the SDGs have recognized this transformative power of urbanization with the dedicated goal of SDG 11, which is really focused on cities and human settlements. And so the role of urban actors extends to all 17 SDGs, really underscoring that local government achievements on urban targets are going to complement the entire SDG framework. I would say in the last 2 decades, cities have really been the drivers of innovative, sustainable development at the local level. And when it comes to the SDGs, it's clear that not all cities are going to work at the same speed or have the same starting position. So ambitious and innovative cities that have been pioneers in sustainable urban development are going to push and lead this agenda and provide an example for those other cities that are needing a little bit more support or role modeling. And even though local governments are increasingly being recognized for their accomplishments as champions for sustainable development, they do require capacity and resources to ensure that further urban development is well organized and equitable. So those are just some thoughts from a local scale.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura and Danielle and Luis and Kusum, about kind of framing, localizing the SDGs and how they can be so impactful or meaningful to communities. I want to shift a little bit and ask Kusum and Luis as well, your experiences with developing the voluntary local reviews for the SDGs. Actually, Laura, I understand you have a kind of an understanding of the status across Canada, what's happening with the voluntary local reviews, the VLRs as they refer to them, for cities and communities that are measuring their progress on the SDGs. Could you share a little bit about that?
For sure. So definitely over the last years, we've seen momentum building here, right? So we've seen Kelowna and Winnipeg release VLRs in 2021. Many other communities are working on or exploring voluntary local reviews. There's a big movement worldwide to develop VLRs, and there's over 120 that have been developed thus far. So Canada's actually lagging a bit. A lot of other countries have many more subnational levels of government that have developed VLRs. But there are a lot of SDG localization efforts in Canada that are not VLRs, and we should always be speaking about those too. So some include Luis on the call today. We'll speak about London's work to localize the indicators. There's been great work in Peterborough, Quebec City, Northwest Territories, Kitchener, Waterloo, Sault Ste. Marie, Thunder Bay, just to name a few. And we really unpack a lot of these stories in the guide, 10 guide on advancing the SDGs in your community, which I see has been shared in the chat. So would it definitely encourage you to take a look at that. And I just also wanted to shout out to Mohammed Azrak, who's part of our community of practice and has been doing research at Trent University in Peterborough the last couple of years. His thesis on SDG localization efforts. And his thesis itself really dives into a lot of great case studies around localization efforts. So tons of work happening and tons more we could be doing. When I think about worldwide, what a spike in the last years we've seen around VLRs relative to voluntary national reviews that have remained quite stable. So a few thoughts from the national perspective. Thanks
very much, Laura. And Kusum, can you tell us more then about your experiencing in diving into the details of developing the VLR for Kelowna and what that meant for you?
Sure. So as Laura mentioned, Canada is a bit lagging behind. So we started in 2017, and to be honest, it was overwhelming and difficult. But you know, any framework, when you first start out, you have to invest the time, and once you put in that time, then it's just maintenance work from there on. So in the beginning, we did a lot of heavy front end research. So we looked at VLRs that were carried out internationally in North America, but also just different, as Laura mentioned, SDG projects. So we looked at work carried out by Brookings Institute, IISD, BCCIC, and even organizations like World Council for City Data. So after we kind of did that heavy front end work, we carried out 2 approaches. And the first approach was looking at the sustainability agenda already underway in Kelowna. So we reviewed municipal planning documents, and we aligned them with the SDGs. We tried to see how city goals, city targets kind of line up with the 169 targets and 232 UN indicators. And then our second approach, we started off with the UN indicators, and then we looked at available subnational data. So we looked at federal, provincial sustainability development strategies, reports from academia, researchers, and think tanks. And we had a lot of communications with civil society organizations. They're the community actors that have a lot of this information. They not only can provide quantitative information, but they provide a lot of qualitative. So they give that kind of that rounded picture, because numbers you can see in one way, but with the qualitative information, it kind of gives us a better rounded picture. And I do want to make another point. So with the Kelowna VLR, we did map out the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And, as we know, Canada has a dark history of colonization and discrimination. And it's important for us to note, whether consciously or subconsciously, these are reflected in our policies. So our project used the TRC calls to action because it outlines a path towards reconciliation. And many Indigenous peoples and communities in Canada have been the recipients of dishonest actions and tokenized gestures. So this process was difficult for us, but it was something that we did carry out because we wanted to understand what meaningful change actually means, not from our perspective, because my perspective is going to be different from somebody who's actually experiencing the issues. So we really try to empathize and try to understand, just because I understand what the issue is, it doesn't mean the outcome has changed. That is just a very small step towards resolving or working towards reconciliation. So a big thing we learned is, you have to listen to empathize and understand rather than listening to respond. And we really, really have to check our personal biases as individuals, but also as the organizations approaching other people.
Great. Thank you, Kusum. Thank you, Laura. I'm going to move it now. We do have a question from the audience. David Capelli is a guest who's joined us. He's also new with a new local pathways fellow with the UN SDSN. And he's touching on, Kusum, what you talked about in identifying policy and how it ties into the SDGs. His question is, how are leaders in Canada localizing and contextualizing the SDGs to specific identified local policy challenges? He mentions that this is a challenge in the US. Most work and solutions are divorced of the policy challenges being addressed. Philanthropy in the US, many through donor-advised funds, aren't designed to fund BIPOC or any TEEPs, focusing on solutions that align with public policy and local challenges. So maybe I'll ask Laura and Kusum and maybe Danielle and Luis, if any of you want to pitch in there with that question we've got.
I can try to answer part of that question. So with the Kelowna VLR, we were a third-party facilitator, because basically every institution, they have their own lens. So you have to push, if you work for that institution, you have to push that lens through. You have to push that mandate through. And by being a third-party facilitator, we were able to get the perspectives from municipal governments, regional governments, Indigenous organizations, NGOs. We were able to get that information even from marginalized groups, and kind of, we talked about polarization, but being a third-party facilitator, we kind of grabbed that information and we were able to present it. We knew where trust already existed in the community, and we tried to build on it. So that's kind of how we try to approach it. And also, ideally, if there were unlimited resources and money, yeah, you could start from scratch and develop new policies and programs. But the reality is, if you want something to succeed, you have to build on what's already there. And so that's why we looked at existing policies and programs, and then kind of provided additional data and then recommendations based on existing community actors in the community.
Do you want?
I can
Sorry,
jump
go
in just to add a little bit of perspective of the VLR that we had here. When we did the SDG localization efforts here, just a couple of years earlier, we had an economic development plan, and we had a poverty reduction plan. And the interesting things that we noticed, because like soon we're looking a lot at the municipal documents and policies, right, and trying to match that to those global goals. What we learn is that those groups and a huge community engagement, and that's why it's important to have a group and organization that can be the convening of those multi-sector groups. Those two documents, they did not overlap at all in terms of priorities, in terms of goals, and even in terms of the networks and people who were working on those, which to me was mind-blowing, that we have an economic plan and a poverty reduction plan that do not talk to each other. So part of the work that we did with the SDGs is actually putting those two together. And it's not an ideal word yet, but I think that's one of the strengths of the SDGs, is that to really try to bring together, to bridge a lot of those public policies and different interest groups that might be talking about different things. Oh, I shouldn't say different things. It should very much related and intersecting issues, but in different ways, in different spaces. And I'll leave it at there.
Okay, thanks. Danielle, do you want to comment a little bit on that? I mean, I know from my experience with connecting with you and Kusum and working on the VLR. I mean, I come from a climate action background, but it was interesting to see how the city of Kelowna is looking at many different issues now and cross-cutting some of those sectors in attempts to address climate and other sustainability and healthy city strategies as well.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. And just building on what Kusum has already addressed, local governments are increasingly resource constrained and having to make really important trade-off decisions. So as we've already kind of highlighted, taking a really deep policy scan of what activities are already resourced and how can they be leveraged or retooled to support and amplify the SDG agenda. So that's really, I think, the essence of how Kusum and the team approached Kelowna, is really understanding what was already existing activities in multiple SDG areas and how to leverage them as an opportunity to amplify. So yeah, for example, we have multiple activities here in Kelowna that are either working on a more progressive growth strategy and optimizing land use, re-examining multimodal transportation delivery and equitable access of transportation options to our citizens. How do we embed equity as a lens in all kind of city services and functions and programs that we have an opportunity to deliver differently? Food security, climate action, and even our environmental conservation efforts. All of these are existing core business that have a critical intersection with the SDGs and being able to amplify that broader agenda.
All right, maybe shifting gears a little bit. I was wondering, Laura and Luis, if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on how these voluntary local reviews might influence or can influence Canada's voluntary national review. So any thoughts on that in terms of the reporting and how we can create better connection maybe amongst those entities?
I can go first this time. I think one of the important things to know and understand about the SDGs and and Danielle mentioned that we have the SDG 11 that is specifically about cities, is that there's a clear understanding that a lot of the SDG implementation happens at the local level. And even the SDG and even the decision making about a lot of the issues that related to the SDGs, and a few of them were already mentioned, right? You think about landing and zoning and transportation and road infrastructure, public spaces, solid waste, landfills, watersheds and water treatment and conservation. There's so housing and homelessness and all the municipal mechanisms, and still the cities in Canada, and that there are differences from province to province, are, as we say, creatures of the province, right? They're under the regulation of the province, and obviously highly dependent on federal funds. So when you think about how the VLRs can influence, how that can play out, it's really highlighting, and as we said, also the different realities and the amount of work, and also the amount of impact, positive impacts that we can create at the local level. If this can really come and be part of the VNR, can be part of a national analysis of what is happening and how we're progressing towards those goals, based on local reports, based on the voluntary local reviews, I think they would be extremely helpful for Canada and really any country. And there are countries that actually integrate voluntary local reviews in their national reviews because of that understanding, right? That to really move forward with the SDG agenda is important to understand what happens at this local level.
Yeah, totally. Echo what you shared, Luis. Like, there's no achieving the SDGs in Canada if not for local level action. And this is really the level where meaningful change is happening. And we're seeing so many examples of this right across the country. And this is Canada's second voluntary national review happening this year. Its first was in 2018. That one in 2018 really missed the mark in terms of highlighting the need for local efforts and putting an emphasis on that. But we were in really early days of implementing the SDGs, and they weren't really well organized and resourced, and didn't necessarily have that full understanding. But 5 years have passed since then, and today there's really no excuse. So we're really sending that message loud and clear to the government that VLRs and local SDG efforts should be prominent and central. And we underscored it in our own contribution to the Voluntary National Review, which there's still time to contribute to because the deadline is tomorrow. So we'll put a link in the chat for how folks can contribute, but Canada is right now welcoming feedback on that. So it's an opportunity to send this message and also to showcase your local work and bring visibility to your project that hopefully will get included in the national review and have much greater visibility.
Great. We've got a couple of questions from the audience as well, and maybe I'll bring these up there in context of the VLRs. Invite any of you panelists to respond to them then. So we have an anonymous attendee who's asked a question. Given the weakened public trust in governmental institutions, is there any way to add some aspect of accountability to the VLRs, a way for individuals of the public and government to take them seriously, to get engaged? We've got consultation on the VNR happening right now. Is there any thoughts about how we can better improve accountability for VLRs?
That's a great question. And I'll jump in super briefly, and if anyone wants to add, but if you see at the example what happened in London and Kelowna, and really in many of the cities in Canada, rarely the VLR or any kind of SDG mapping or analysis at the local level, it starts with the local government. It's really, it's either the nonprofit sector, it's the philanthropy, in some cases, academic institutions, but it's really community organizations who are trying to lead or at least be the convener, and with an understanding a lot of the data needs to come from local governments, with an understanding that there needs to be a support from local higher education institutions that have the willpower to do that research that goes into a VLR. But it is, for the most part, the VLR is already an essentially community-driven effort in Canada.
Okay, and that actually leads to the next question from the audience, from Steve Bernheim. Have you seen private local groups initiating voluntary reviews as a method to force intransigent local government to take climate action? Now, I'll maybe pass that to you, Kusum, because you were kind of an entity that worked alongside the city to develop the VLR. And maybe, Danielle, you could talk a little bit about how that might have influenced the climate action with the city.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, because we were, we're not I'm not part of a private institution. It's a CSO, and the SDG framework is the primary mandate. And to be honest, like, people within Kelowna were telling me that municipal staff seem to be open to in Kelowna, we're open to the concept, open to different concept. And so I thought, hey, why don't we approach City of Kelowna? And one thing I want to say is, I think a lot of I've spoken to different municipalities, and they're nervous sometimes to use the SDGs because they say, you're going to point out how we're doing poorly. And my response is always, no, it's not. We're not trying to show that you're doing bad in certain areas. Yeah, there's going to be weaknesses, but there's going to be strengths. But the point of the SDGs is, fine, we highlight the areas where maybe policies need to be realigned, they need to be strengthened, but then we're helping provide the data so that maybe you can access funding resources or just different community actors. Because I think, building a community, a sustainable community, is not just the responsibility of the government. And honestly, we don't want them to be solely responsible, because that's one perspective, that's one take. I think it should be all these different actors, and that's what the SDGs promote. It's the society as a whole and partnerships, because you get different perspectives and put it all together into one story so that we can work together to achieve the goals.
Do you have some additional thoughts on that, Danielle?
Sure, and thanks, Kusum, for kind of very eloquently laying that out. I do just want to share that I would say generally right now, local governments are in a very risk-adverse space. Many governments, at least in BC, have recently just onboarded new council members. And so they are just reestablishing their council priorities for the next 4 years. And frankly, there's a lot of urgent, very pressing issues that they're needing to figure out how they're going to prioritize resource allocation. So as Kusum shared, this needs to be held up and intentionally shared across many different organizations and community members, because local government in isolation, I don't believe has that full risk permission to invite areas that they feel they're perhaps not performing as well. So sharing this responsibility across many different actors and other partners that are a little bit more risk tolerant, I believe, is our path forward.
Thanks, Danielle. And Laura, you'd put something in the chat there about
Yes, that was to the other question, just about declining trust. I think one great way to tackle this is to be really open and transparent in reporting. So rather than just producing the VLR, really have something ongoing that residents can use and can consult with to understand how we're progressing on different goals. And MyPeg and Winnipeg, is a great tracking progress platform for local institutions and residents to use, and it's part of the tracking progress tool IISD developed, and I'll put a link to that one too. So it's available for other communities to use and create and adapt to their own context in collaboration with IISD.
Great. Okay, I guess Laura, you just mentioned the Winnipeg example, but are there other programs or initiatives that can assist cities and communities in implementing the SDGs? Maybe.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, so the tracking progress is definitely one. Alliance 2030 is a great platform for those not familiar. It's civil society led but multi-sectoral partnership to advance the SDGs in Canada, and it came out of Canada 150, which was this partnership around galvanizing civil society and other sectors to organize events and collaborate around Canada's 150th celebrations, we could put in quotes, and then it transformed post 2015 into the Alliance 2030, and actually just was a little bit, there's a little bit less action from them in the last couple of years, but it's really picking up this year. So I would say stay tuned, join their mailing list if you're not already on it, and stay tuned for many opportunities there to connect with others around the SDGs. The community of practice that we co-host was, I already mentioned. Vital signs reports are a great one, initiated by Community Foundations of Canada and individual community foundations. They really track progress locally and across a number of indicators, and many of them are aligning with the SDGs. So that's a great place to go often for SDG aligned data locally. And the Canadian indicator framework that Canada developed with 76 indicators deemed relevant for Canada from the SDG framework is also a helpful starting point, along with Canada's data hub. So those are a few.
Luis, do you have more to add on that, or some?
I think Laura was very comprehensive.
Yeah.
There's definitely so much information there. If you really want to take a deep dive, either in the more local level and then at the national level as the national indicator framework, which is, it's an interesting step between the global goals and local goals. In a way, the Canadian indicator framework is it's one level of localizing. It's looking at those 232 indicators and really understanding what that does even make sense to our context here in Canada, and creating our own domestic national framework of SDGs.
Great, thanks. And Kusum and Danielle, Luis kind of said and Laura shared these tools that exist in accessing data. And I'm wondering how we can ensure that we're measuring comparable data between cities that have different realities and capacities. And what are your thoughts on that based on your experience, Kusum?
So as I mentioned before, like we all know, Canada is a large country geographically with its economic activity, population densities. So the issues faced in one end of Canada is going to be drastically different than the other end of Canada. So when we look at even provinces, territories, narrow it down to regions, cities and communities, the issues faced are going to be drastically different. So it is difficult sometimes and not necessarily valuable to compare data from one city to another. And some of these reasons are just simply for data quality. You know, it can be affected by a community's population size, access to services. When you look at urban versus rural, they're going to be drastically different. So is it really fair to compare it? So the issues faced by communities are not necessarily relevant to each other. However, having said that, comparisons are helpful, And what we did for the Kelowna VLR is we made comparisons to provincial data. And if there were provincial targets or available community targets, then we compared it to that. Because I think it's important to set a target. Otherwise, what are you working towards, right? What are you trying to achieve? And then, if you look at another community and you see they're doing well, dive into their policies and programs and see if your community can benefit from it. But those comparisons, one-to-one community don't always work.
Danielle, can you talk a little bit about how cities can best manage accessing and sharing data as well amongst other cities in?
Sure. I think as Kusum just emphasized, larger metro centers are going to have a more robust set of indicators and or data available that complement some of their current initiatives and programs than perhaps smaller, more rural communities that are perhaps much more resource constrained. So we are in the process, for example, at the City of Kelowna, re-examining a portal that we can use for both open data sources, but also just merge many of our data sets that have interdependencies and think about the narrative or kind of that qualitative piece and how it merges with other data sets. So we're just re-examining how we can be more sophisticated ourselves in using data to make evidence-based decisions alongside that financial element. So most communities in BC belong to a regional government. And so I think understanding regional government data sets and the interrelationship, because not all data exists at a local scale, and perhaps it needs to be a little bit more broadened. So I think having partnerships with regional districts and the data that they get to harness, I think can amplify and fill in some of those gaps from local governments.
Okay, so looking at things from a regional perspective can be very helpful for the cities within those regions.
Yes.
Well, we're coming down to our last 10 minutes together, 5-10 minutes together. And I do have a wrap-up question. I was hoping maybe each of the panelists could comment on. Mostly it's just a general question about the opportunity to tell us more about how our cities and local community organizations can work most effectively together to raise awareness of the importance of the SDGs. So, is there someone who wants to jump in there?
I can jump in since our project is really in a way it's hyper local, it's London and Guelph, but we want to really create tools that can be applied, can be used, translated to any other city in Canada. So in our program, and we launched this recently, I'll put the link on the chat. I think we're talking about depolarization, and I think a lot of it is really understand what are the potentials for the SDG framework at the local level. So we have a SDG 101 course online. It's free online and it's self-paced. You will get a micro credential at the end of the training, and we'll take you through understanding what SDGs are in Canada and some of the efforts that are happening across the country and information and resources about SDGs in Canada. We shared about the municipal election toolkit also as well. We did this for the election, the 2022 municipal elections that we had in quite a few provinces in Canada. We designed the toolkit in a way that is still applicable beyond the elections. It's just not an engagement tool during the election period, but also a really rich resource guide about many of the initiatives that are happening across the country and how we can engage with local government, how we can hold your elected officials accountable for that. And working in a few other events and training opportunities. And you can always check on our website, sdgcities.ca. You always have new information and blogs and resources posted there.
Thanks, Louise.
Happy to jump in here.
Sure.
So I love this question because at Tamarack, we're all about whole community approaches to change and how to engage everyone. And, you know, you listed cities and local community organizations who are typically those most involved in this work, but definitely there's a role for businesses, for schools, schools like K-12 and post-secondary. Residents are really crucial to involve and not just engage with, but really have around your table, decision-making table, and specifically those with lived and living experience with the challenges we're working to solve. So I would recommend like starting with a leadership roundtable that has that broad representation, then going out and doing a broader engagement to make sure really listening to the voices of community. And when you go out and do that engagement, framing the conversation around issues that matter to the community. So the SDGs themselves might not be the best framing to lead with, but really go out and listen. Kusum, you said it earlier, listen to understand, listen to empathize, understand what issues are top of mind for folks. And these will most likely connect with the SDGs. And if they don't, that might be part of the process of localizing the framework. So one example of that is in Peterborough, where they did a major listening and engagement process and identified local priorities were poverty, education, clean water, climate action, and reconciliation. So those were goals 1, 4, 6, 13, and reconciliation not being an explicit SDG or even showing up very much in the framework at all, frankly, they decided to reinterpret goal 17 around partnerships as partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in the community to advance reconciliation. So I really love that example, and that speaks to the power of localization. And then really meet people where they're at and develop relationships so that one can join events that partners are hosting rather than hosting one's own session and hope that you get a broad representation of people coming. And then just finally to this question, since you really asked like how can we work to raise awareness of the importance of the SDGs, I just want to highlight that, of course, we need to go far beyond awareness raising. And in a sense, if we focus on taking action, even like small steps and quick wins, I think the awareness will come out of that. So it's really time to move beyond action with this framework, beyond awareness and towards action.
Okay, thanks, Laura, for that. Yeah. We do have a quick question in the from our audience. Louise, can you remind us what the course is you had mentioned, the SDG Academy?
I think we shared on the chat. It was the last
On the chat? Okay, great. Yeah.
that we have on the chat is the link to the course. You can register there, and then you'll redirect you to an online platform where you can go through. There are like some videos, some text. There are 4 different modules for that course. Again, like I said, a little bit of the context of SDGs in Canada and what does it mean to localize and how local SDG action looks like. And at the end, you will get like a badge, a micro credential for taking the course.
Okay, great, thanks. So I want to reiterate that what you'd said, Laura, about awareness to action. And I was wondering, Danielle and Kusum, what might be happening in Kelowna now in context of now there has been this awareness, and what kind of action might we expect on the SDGs as a result of the VLR and the experience that you two have had there.
Well, I will share that our VLR report does not have council endorsement, so it wasn't formally endorsed and received by our council. But what I can share is that at a staff level, this is finding its way into our base business and our work planning and thinking about tackling many of the issues that we've talked about today, and approaching many of these issues through kind of a multi-pronged approach. So whether it's from policy, program, infrastructure, or capital delivery, really thinking about where the city can amplify efforts and more deliberately weave that into our base business approach. And then lastly, thinking about our role as a convener when we're engaging with the public and seeking out partnerships with community. Who best can facilitate, educate, and create space that is safe for those participants that have been marginalized or silenced in previous practices. So those are just some current examples of how it's showing up in the city of Kelowna today.
Thank you very much. Now I have just a couple of minutes left on my clock here. There is one more question. I was wondering maybe, Kusum, I could ask you from the audience, who do you see being well positioned to lead the SDG viewpoint of unifying communities? For example, there are many anti-poverty organizations in a community, each pursuing their own mission. How do you help them come together? What type of orgs or leaders are you seeing that help foster that kind of meta-level collaboration? And Kusum, you talked a little bit about how you'd convened many organizations to develop the VLR. Who do you see as the leadership in doing that, in making progress?
So, I mean, in our case, it was BC Council for International Cooperation because it's a regional hub and they're linked to many of the community actors in different cities. And so, yeah, every community, like there might be, for example, 10 organizations working on anti-poverty strategies. But the reality is, like, we approach numerous organizations. A lot of them don't have time. They're so backlogged in trying to help people. And so we want to help highlight their work, but we don't want to add to it. So in some cases, we just, they said they can't help. They're just backlogged, but they pointed us to research. But we also didn't want to misrepresent them. So we said, hey, do you have time to read what we wrote about your research? Can you make sure we didn't misrepresent you or the people that you're talking about? Sometimes they just pointed us to different organizations that might help. But the reality is, a lot of organizations are just simply overworked. So if we can bring them as a third party to the table and then find out, hey, can you provide this, then you can also see how these 10 organizations are actually working in silos, and maybe we can connect them and kind of take on different priorities.
Thank you very much, Kusum. It was kind of like the leadership roundtable that Laura mentioned also to inspire that in taking action. So I think we're at time. That hour flew by for me. And I want to thank our guests, the panelists here. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge and your experience in localizing the SDGs. I guess that's it for us today, coming together. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and thanks to all of those for joining us online, and thanks for the team behind the scenes as well, helping to carry out this webinar. We hope you have a great rest of the day and a great rest of SDG week. So thank you very much again, everyone. Wonderful to have you all with us. Thank you.